G'day guys, this is a follow-up video to my Nationals training video. Thanks for the views on that, by the way. It did really well, but that perhaps left people with a false impression of my training in the past, because that training prep was a culmination of probably 20 or 25 different specific race builds I've done over the last 7 or 8 years, and they haven't all gone that well. I've made a ton of mistakes. So in this video, I want to go through a whole bunch of mistakes I've made in my training that I think have limited my potential as a rider and meant that I didn't get the race results that I probably could have with my level of talent. First, and probably one of the biggest training mistakes I made, was focusing too much on fresh power. As a bigger rider, as a heavier rider, I always had pretty good raw power, and my ego meant that I always wanted to train to build that. Now, this worked to some degree. I was fantastic in a crit. I was fantastic in a 2-hour road race. But on the domestic scene, get me out to a 4, a 5, a 6-hour road race, and I'd go from probably top 5 domestically back in my time to maybe top 20. Like, there'd be a whole bunch of guys that get to the 5th hour of a road race and they'd kick my ass because I just never trained, or I very rarely trained to be doing good efforts in the 4th, 5th hour of training. Partly ego, partly lack of planning in my regard. If I knew what I knew now, I would have planned my training better and done more training efforts fatigued. If I was going out for a 2x20, 9 out of 10 times I'd do it at the start of the ride because I'd do more power and it felt good. If I had put a bit more preparation and planning into what I was actually doing, I could have moved this around, got to very similar levels of raw fitness, and had much better durability and fatigue resistance. And that affected me a lot in races. It's something I now know not to do. And as you saw in that Nationals video, I got that right. But it's kind of too little too late for me, and that's something I regret with my own training. So that's probably the biggest one, is don't lie to yourself in that just because you've got a good FTP, that you're necessarily going to be good in the 5th hour of a road race if you're doing long road races. So you really got to be honest with what training you're doing. Make sure it's specific for the race you're doing, not just specific for seeing good watts. Next one, this plagued me for years, and it's tapering too hard before races. So backing off the training load too much and coming into key races too fresh. How this sort of happened was, I was following sort of the generic endurance training advice for tapering, which is we should back off about 60% in terms of training load for perhaps a week long. And for years, I would come into races too fresh and I would underperform. In training, I would be doing great. I'd hit PBs in training. I would be doing really good efforts in training. And then I'd have my target race come up. I would taper. I would come in way too fresh. I'd start the race or the time trial, my heart rate would go through the roof, my lungs would be burning, and then I would struggle to even match the numbers in that race that I was doing in training. And I'm almost embarrassed to say how long it took me to figure out that I just was tapering too hard. I was way too fresh. The funny thing is that it was right in front of my eyes. So for example, at a National Road Series race here in Australia, if we were doing a tour, let's say a 5-day tour, I would taper for that as normal. I would feel like shit on the first day. Second day, I might feel a bit better. Third, fourth, fifth day, where on paper I'm too fatigued and I shouldn't be performing that well, I would come out flying. Fourth day, negative 25 TSB, negative 30 TSB, and I'd be smacking PBs all over the place. And it's just because, for whatever reason, with my physiology, my body performs better with a higher level of load in the system. And it just took me ages to figure that out, even though it seems simple now when I look back on it. But yeah, so now I know that coming into a race, I can't come in too fresh. I need to simulate those levels of fatigue where I perform best at. And it took me way too long to figure this out. And it's something that if you're coming into race days and you're performing not as well as you would expect, have a look in detail at your taper, how much you're backing off training. If you're hitting good numbers in training and then not really hitting them in racing, there is a chance you may be coming in too fresh. So make sure you go and analyze that. Next mistake I made in my training, which was quite early on, maybe 2015 to 2017, is that I would only really be happy with my training if it was tiring. So for example, if I had a 3-hour endurance ride, went out and did that, got back, and I wasn't tired, in my head, I was thinking, this isn't really productive training. So I'd go out the next day and purposefully just do a hard session so that I feel tired. I think that's, now obviously if you've watched my videos, you probably realize that's not a good way to train. It's not necessarily an effective way to train. But when you don't have faith in your training you're doing, or an understanding of the physiology behind the training you're doing, you end up coming back to, well, is this training making me tired? Well, it must be working. And that's kind of what I did for a few years. Now, if you're someone that's doing that, and I guess for me doing that back in the day, firstly, you're probably pretty driven, which is a good thing. And that's probably gotten you pretty strong. Like if you train like that, you're probably pretty good. But you will plateau earlier, and you're going to struggle to really push when you're pushing upper levels of fitness. You're going to struggle to push through that, because when you're really trying to get your body to get to a place fitness-wise it doesn't want to go, going out and doing sessions just to be tired is not the way to do it. There needs to be more of a structure to it. So I made that mistake for years. If you're someone who's training based on how many calories you ate for dinner the night before, if you ate a few too many, or, I'm feeling a bit too fresh today and I think I'm just going to go ride really hard. If your training isn't based on the session that's in there in terms of structuring the week and therefore structuring the month that has a purpose, you should really second guess that. And as you probably saw, I would recommend you go watch that Nationals training video. If you did, you'll see in that training block I would go 3, 4, 5 days without doing any efforts, with the goal of actually feeling better in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th day while accumulating training volume, because that's the way that still has a training stimulus, still gives me an adaptation, even though I'm not making myself more tired. And yeah, it took me far too long to learn that process. So yeah, have a plan, have a structure. Don't just train to make yourself tired. That's not how you get to elite levels of fitness. It'll get you so far. It's not going to get you to your absolute potential if you're looking to push it. Another problem I made early in my racing development was that I just didn't do enough sprint or anaerobic work. I was really mostly training as an endurance athlete to get fitter, and I really ignored the sprint work. And all this meant was that from the years of, again, probably 2015 to 2018, I was rolling around on any given month with a sprint over most durations between sort of 0 and 10 seconds. That was about 150 or 200 watts under where it could have been if I had just trained my sprint. The thing with training a sprint, if you do it properly, is that it doesn't need to detract from your aerobic training. You fit it in on the days coming off for a rest day, for example, or you just fit it in your endurance work. It doesn't need to come at the expense of your aerobic adaptations. And if you're someone who's road cycling, you're going to need to have a sprint to some degree. Like thinking in my head, like how many races did I do where I was in a position to win or get a podium, where I was 100 or 200 watts off from my top end sprint? And it wasn't really until 2019, 2020 that I included more sprint work, more sprint focus blocks. And I was the same fitness, I was the same ride, I was doing pretty much the same amount of training, except I had a much better sprint and I could win sprints if I needed to. And yeah, it's just something I essentially ignored for too many years. And I think that did cost me a lot of results in my racing. So if you are someone that's racing, even if you're not a sprinter, you need to have a decent sprint. How are you going to get results if all you can do is go away solo? Like it's a waste not to work on your sprint, because you can have both. It doesn't need to come at the expense of your endurance training. Following on from this sprint idea, and this is not directly training related, it comes back to how I raced, is that I treated every single race as if it was an A priority race. This includes all my club races. So I would rock up to my Saturday afternoon club race, and I'm going in here and I'm going to do everything I can to win. And what's my best chance of winning? Because I was relatively strong, is I'm just going to attack the shit out of this group until I'm either getting away solo or I'm getting away with one or two others, and then I'm going to try and win the reduced bunch sprint between the one or two guys. And I did this for years. And what it meant was In all these opportunities, I had to practice different tactics and practice my bunch sprint. I didn't do it. What this meant was that in literally, I would probably say hundreds of racing opportunities, because I raced a lot, like multiple times a week. In all these racing opportunities, I was missing chances to learn how to sprint from a group of 10 or learn how to sprint from a group of 25 in a bunch sprint. And all I was getting good at was just pounding my strengths. I was already strong. I could already get away solo. And I never got to develop the ability to position myself in a bunch. Sprint off the wheel, going 60k an hour with guys beside you. And it's just, I wish I had done that more often. It was a development opportunity that I didn't take. I mean, it worked. It meant I got a crap load of results, but they were club results. They were sort of meaningless, and they were development opportunities that I missed. I wish in my earlier days in my career, I would have just gone, okay, this race, it's not the end of the world. I'm just not going to do any attacks. I'm going to follow the bunch. I'm going to make sure it ends in a big bunch sprint. I'm going to practice winning from a group of 30. If I had done that, I would have been a much better rider all around. Next training mistake I made was not training enough in different positions. So what I essentially morphed myself into was this hyper efficient powerhouse in the saddle. And I was so bad out of the saddle. Like, even at the same power. So in Grafton to Inverell National Road Series race, for example, which starts off with 70k mostly flat, and then you go into a 45-minute long, very steady climb. And most of the time going up the climb, you're redlining, you're sitting at threshold, right? I would go up that climb, and I could not get out of the saddle. Because as soon as I stood up, even at the same power, my heart rate would go up, my effort level would go up, and it was just terrible because I just hadn't spent enough time training out of the saddle that I just couldn't do that. Now, you might say, well, okay, I had really good seated power, but the problem is when you're going up a long climb, if all you can do is sit down, you start getting a sore back and you're focusing all that load through the exact same muscles with no change. So having the ability up a climb to stay seated, get out of the saddle for a minute, sit back down, and not have your heart rate fluctuating all over the place and your lactate going all over the place is really important. It's something I never had because I had good seated power. So I'd train good seated power and I'd get better seated power. And then I was totally ineffective riding out of the saddle. The way to fix this was just not necessarily to do all my hard efforts out of the saddle, but I just incorporated more time out of the saddle in my low and moderate intensity. So sweet spot efforts, I would force myself out of the saddle. In my endurance rides, I'd force myself out of the saddle. To the point where it actually became a joke. So on Chris Miller's channel, he did a video with Jay Vine talking about his training, and I was riding next to Jay in that video. And people were commenting like, what's wrong with Jesse? Like, does he ride all the time out of the saddle? And that's because that ride, that was a year ago. Me doing that ride 5 years ago, I would be sitting down pretty much the entire time. So that's just a result of me making changes to my training to build more efficiency out of the saddle. Next training mistake I made was being too impatient training in different conditions. So this might be if I flew overseas to go to a race or a training camp, or maybe just the weather change if I was coming into summer. I didn't really appreciate the impact that the external conditions can have on performance. So for example, we were racing over in Europe. We got a late invite to do the Tour of Utah. So we did a few weeks training block in Park City, Utah, in the middle of summer, and it's super hot. It's at altitude, so I get there, and second day I'm off doing 40-20s and 3-minute max efforts and all this stuff because I need to get fit for this race, so I need to just train really hard. Without taking into account that I'm riding in the middle of the day, it's 38 degrees Celsius. I'm at nearly 3,000 meters of altitude, and I just hammered myself, and my performance in that race sucked. And if I just had better consideration, a bit more, cut myself and my body a bit more slack, and just ease into it, get there, relax. You got the stress of travel, then you got the stress of the environment. Like, Jesse, just relax, settle in, do your endurance rides, give yourself 4, 5, 6 days just to ease into it without any intensity. And then when you're feeling good and your body's acclimated and you're really feeling like you're going to respond well, then hit the intensity. That is about it for this video. For someone who's training at elite level, hope you got something out of this video and don't make the same mistakes that I did earlier on. Thanks for watching this far if you have, and I'll catch you in the next one.